Today we're going to talk all about fabric. So in the comments sections of my videos, as well as in my email, I get a lot of questions about fabric and pre-cuts, how I store them, how I wash them, all of that. So I compiled a list and I'm going to answer all of your questions that I have gotten over the last couple of months. So the most common question I get is whether or not I pre-wash my fabric. And there are two reasons why I do not pre-wash my fabric. The first is that I really like that kind of crinkly look that a quilt gets when it's first washed. If you pre-wash your fabric and then make your quilt won't shrink as much in that first washing, and so it will continue to lay pretty flat. It'll look more like you just finished the quilt. Whereas if you don't pre-wash and then make your quilt and then wash it for that first time, it will kind of crinkle around the lines of stitching that you've put in it, and it'll just give it this really, in my opinion, very cuddly, cozy appearance. The second reason I don't pre-wash my fabric is really just, it's easier to not pre-wash your fabric. You guys see I have a lot of fabric, and washing it and then pressing it and then folding it before I even get to work with it would just be a lot of extra kind of labor in the quilting process, and I like to keep things as simple as possible. Another thing about pre-washing your fabric is if you have pre-washed anything, like I have a couple of, well, they're somewhere around here, a couple of hand-dyed fabrics that I've dyed myself, and as part of the dyeing process, those fabrics are washed. Or if you happen to have fabric that you have already washed, that you want to incorporate into a quilt top, then you really need to pre-wash all of the other fabrics involved in that quilt. Or because that cotton is going to shrink, areas of your quilt will shrink more than other areas, and it will kind of distort your finished quilt. So if anything is pre-washed, then it all has to be pre-washed. The final thing I want to say about pre-washing is that you really shouldn't pre-wash your pre-cuts. Anything smaller than, really even a fat quarter going through the wash is going to lose a lot of the kind of integrity of the edges. And most quilt patterns that call for fat quarters use almost all of that fat quarter. And so you're going to be running really tight on fabric. So I wouldn't pre-wash a pre-cut even if I was a pre-wash fan. Now, the arguments for pre-washing are that your quilt will stay looking new longer because you've already taken care of some of that shrinking that happens. And the other reason that a lot of people pre-wash is to get rid of any bleeding from the printing or dye process. So that is, if, for example, you're making a red and white quilt, a very common color combination, that red dye might bleed into the white a little bit. Now, it's a risk I take because I don't pre-wash. Honestly, it has never happened to me. I've never had a quilt bleed. To hedge against that, I do put color catchers in the wash with all of my freshly finished quilts. And there's also a soap that you can use called Synthropol, which will help keep the dye molecules attached to the fabric and really set any fabric. So if there's a fabric that you've heard bleeds a little bit, or you are making a red and white quilt and you don't want to pre-wash, then check into getting a bottle of Synthropol. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it from a lot of dye suppliers, like Dharma Trading I know carries it, and that will just help your fabrics kind of set their dye a little bit better, and then it will be safe to wash after. So let's talk about pre-cuts. I get a lot of questions about pre-cuts, and I actually wrote a blog post on what all of the different pre-cuts are, and I also linked to my Pinterest board where I keep all of my ideas for the various pre-cuts. So there is a board just for charm squares and a board just for layer cakes, and that's where I kind of accumulate all of my patterns that I find around the internet and put them there so that if I'm looking for a pattern just for a jelly roll, I know right where to look. So I've put all of those links on a blog post, and the link to that blog post is in the description below this video here. You might have to click on something like show more or something like that in the little section of text under this video, and a bunch of links will pop up. As for what my favorite pre-cuts are, I'm really partial to layer cakes and fat quarter bundles. I just really like a layer cake. I think that 10-inch square is just a really nice piece of fabric to work with. I have generally found them to be fairly consistent and square, whereas I love a fat quarter bundle, don't get me wrong, but sometimes manufacturers do not always cut them especially straight. I've had a lot of fat quarters that are kind of like parallelograms. So I have found that 10-inch squares are usually pretty reliably square. And so I can open up a layer cake and start sewing with it. And there's no fold lines, which is awesome. So I can open it up and start cutting and sewing and have a cool top in no time. Now I do like and use all precuts, but the thing I keep in mind when I am buying a precut is the scale of the print in the line. For example, I bought a fat quarter bundle of a Tula Pink collection a couple years ago, and it was her Halloween collection, and it had these great like faces, this Day of the Dead kind of face, and in my whole fat quarter bundle I didn't get a single usable portrait, and it was really disappointing. So keep that in mind. If you are buying a line that you love because it has such great big vivid prints, then a jelly roll, are you going to be able to appreciate that print? So that's what I keep in mind when I am buying precuts. So if I'm buying something like an ombre, then a jelly roll is perfect because you get that long width of fabric cut. Whereas a charm pack, which I don't even think they make charm packs of like the ombre lines, it would look just like a solid piece of fabric. When I am looking at a line that I want to buy that has a couple of big feature prints, I'll often buy a pre-cut, and then I will buy like a yard of the 2 or 3 really big prints in the line, just to kind of hedge my bets and give me something that I know I'll be able to work with. If you're buying a pre-cut bundle for a pattern that you know has a very tight cutting schematic, and for example, like the Swoon pattern from Thimble Blossoms, it's a fantastic pattern, but the cutting schematic for that pattern, there is just nothing left of those fat quarters. She uses just every little thread. And so if you are in a situation like that, then I would really advise you to buy like at least a little bit of some of the fabrics beyond that fat quarter bundle, just as insurance, just so if you do miscut or your fat quarters are not cut particularly well, then you'll have a little bit of fabric to draw on. And if you don't use it in the actual blocks, then you can use it for binding, or you can piece it into your backing, or make a little matching pillow, or just put it on your shelves and stare at it for years. Let's talk about starch. I use starch at a couple of different points when I am preparing my fabric or piecing my blocks, and it depends kind of on the pattern that I am planning to make. If there is a bias element to the blocks that I know I'm going to be cutting and sewing, then I will starch my fabric as I am kind of pressing it for the first time. So I've unfolded my bundle, unpackaged it, and I am giving those fat quarters kind of their first go over. And sometimes those lines in fat quarters can be quite intense. And so starching them here gives me a little bit of extra ability to get them flat. And starching also prepares the fabric and gives it a little bit more stability if I know I'm going to be using those kind of bias cuts. So if I'm going to be working with curves, then I always starch my fabric when I'm first pressing it. There are a lot of starch products or starch replacement products on the market. There's Best Press, which is very common. There's Flatter from Soak Company, but I use the good old grocery store Stay Flow. And I buy it in this big jug, and it lasts a long time, and I think that I get really great results with it. So I take this jug and I pour it into one of these misting bottles, these fine misting bottles, and these are awesome. I keep one with starch and I keep one with water, and these are kind of what I keep right by my pressing surface all the time. And it just gives a really, really fine mist. And I really like this. I use the Stay Flow just straight in here because I get such a fine mist out of this bottle. Fabric storage. So you guys obviously see the bulk of my storage behind me. That is where I store all of my fat quarters and yardage that are not part of a bundle. So all of my bundles are in shelves this way, and I keep the bundles just in baskets. So everything on the shelf is a fat quarter or more, and I use comic book boards to store all of my fabric. Comic book boards are the perfect size, and they are much cheaper than kind of the mini bolt, like official alternatives that you'll see in fabric stores. You can get a package of about 200 comic book boards for, the price varies a little bit, but around $20. These shelves are Billy bookcases from IKEA. They were cheap and they were super functional. How much fabric do I buy? When I am shopping for yardage or fabric, I don't often have a pattern in mind, so I have a couple of kind of standard cuts that I buy. Obviously, pre-cuts are kind of their own thing. But when it comes to just yardage, if I am going to be thinking about that fabric for the background of a quilt, then I will usually buy 4 yards. I find that most patterns, all but kind of the biggest quilts, use around 2.5 to 4 yards for the background of the quilt. If I am buying for a binding, then I'll always buy 1 yard. And not all quilts require a yard. Most quilts require closer to like a 1/2 yard, but this just gives me a little bit of flexibility in case I want to repurpose that fabric, or I want to use it in multiple projects, or I just want to have a little bit of extra for my scrap bin or for another project. If I'm buying fabric for the back of a quilt, I will buy 5 yards, and that will make a backing that measures 80 by 90, which means I can quilt a quilt that's about 76 by 85 or so, depending on how much extra room you like to have. But it's a good size chunk of fabric that covers just about all the quilts that I make. I don't often make super gigantic quilts, so 5 yards has always been enough for me. Now, if I'm looking at 108-inch fabric, like the really wide back fabric, then I'll buy 2.5 yards. And that is a really big piece of fabric. It's about 108 inches square. And so that will cover just about any quilt. My long arm can't quilt anything bigger than about 108 inches. So 2.5 yards, I can get 1 really large quilt or 2 smaller quilts from that. If I'm buying basics, I've talked about in a couple videos, I buy bolts of my basic colors. I have bolts of white and black and a couple of grays, and also pickle, which is my favorite Kona color. I buy that by the bolt. Maybe by the time I use up another bolt of it, I won't be so enamored with it. But I do buy bolts of my very favorite colors, the ones that I use all the time, so that I always have them on hand and I don't have to worry about having enough for a specific project. So bias. I feel like bias is kind of a dirty word. I talk about it all the time, but it's really not so bad. So fabric is woven with a warp thread and a weft thread. The warp thread is the really long threads. That's like the 15 yards on a bolt, that 15-yard length. The weft threads are the threads that go the other way. They're the short, like 44-inch threads. As the fabric is woven, these are perpendicular to each other. But then the fabric goes through machines, it's folded, it's rolled on bolts. By the time it gets to you, those threads might be a little off kilter, or the weft thread may not be parallel. It might not match itself from selvage to selvage around that fold as it's wrapped around the bolt. And that means that if you are cutting your fabric as it comes off the bolt, there might be a little bit of bias to those edges. Now, I say a little bit. In the normal course of my quilting life, I do not bother with this. I cut the fabric as it comes off the bolt, and I don't worry about it, because that little like 2% ability to stretch on a normal seam is not something that I feel really impacts my quilt blocks. However, some fabrics are kind of worse offenders at this than others. And an easy way to find the grain of a fabric is to rip the edge. I always rip 108-inch fabrics because they are folded so many times around a bolt that if you were to just cut it, then your edge would be super wonky and it would not be straight. I rip 108-inch fabric. I don't rip regular 44-inch fabric, although some quilt shops do. There's one local to me that always rips their fabric, and there is a big kerfuffle every time someone walks in who doesn't know that they rip their fabric. The last question on my list is about mixing fabric substrates, and it's something that I do all the time. I have made a couple of quilts that have cotton lawns and regular quilting cottons like Kona, and I think that they go really well together. I've even mixed in a little bit of like a heavier weight fabric. I got this really great stripe from Japan that's like a gigantic hamburger, and I put it on the back of the quilt even though it was like a little bit of a heavier fabric, and it's washed up great. So I feel totally comfortable mixing substrates. Now, I don't know if I would sew like a Liberty Lawn, which is like very, very fine, to something like a decor weight fabric and expect them to behave together. But if you want to try and you are willing to experiment, then I would suggest sewing a little sample of the fabrics that you want to combine and just stitching around the edge so it doesn't fray and just throwing it in the washing machine and see what happens. If you have a lot of problem with one fabric, then at least you'll know before you make a whole quilt. So where do I buy fabric? There are several local quilt shops that I love. The one that I go to most often is like a mile and a half from my house. It's amazing. It's called the Dancing Bobbin, and they have a really great selection. But as far as online, there are a couple of shops that I frequent. Fabric Bub is probably my favorite online shop. She carries all of the Kona colors. She has really fast shipping. She makes these great curated bundles and has quilt kits kind of pre-assembled for really popular patterns. It's a really small business and I like supporting them. And if you get on her mailing list, she has coupon codes that she sends out every once in a while. I also like to order from Modern Quilter on Etsy. They offer a lot of pre-orders on upcoming lines, so if there's something that I have my eye on, I can go ahead and pre-order it and then I know that I'll get that fabric. Fatquarter.com is really popular. It has just about everything, so you can almost always find what you're looking for there. I do encourage you to find a local quilt shop though. It's not just the selection of fabric there, but it's also kind of the knowledge that is present there in the employees and the classes they offer. So I really do encourage you to find a local quilt shop. So was there anything I missed in my fabric FAQ? If there was, then leave me a comment below and I will either get back to you or we'll figure something out, but I'll help you out as best as I can. So there are some videos popping up on the screen for something that you might want to watch next. YouTube usually has pretty good recommendations. So I will see you guys next week with another quilt tutorial, and happy quilting. What is going on here?